It began like any ordinary morning at the airport. Passengers filled the terminal, some in a rush, some calm and collected, all just trying to reach their destinations. Among them stood a man dressed sharply in his military uniform, his posture straight, his presence dignified, his eyes focused yet humble. He carried himself with the quiet strength that only years of service can build. But in a world quick to judge, that uniform, that skin color, and that calm composure soon became the target of something ugly, the kind of disrespect that reveals more about others than about the person they mock. As he waited patiently near the boarding gate, a few people nearby began whispering. Their words weren't kind. They noticed his uniform, but didn't see the honor behind it. They saw his skin before they saw his service. One of them snickered, saying something under their breath that was meant to be a joke, but carried poison in its tone. Another laughed louder, trying to impress the small crowd that had started to gather subtle attention. The soldier didn't react. He stood still, his hands calmly folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. Years in the army had taught him discipline, not just in battle, but in how to face disrespect without losing control. But the laughter didn't stop. A woman nearby turned around, shaking her head in disbelief at how casually cruelty was being served in public. "You think wearing that makes you somebody?" one of the mockers said, his voice rising just enough for others to hear. The soldier turned slightly, not out of anger, but simply to acknowledge the man. His eyes met his for a brief moment, calm, unshaken, piercing in quiet strength. That look alone made the man pause for a second, but pride kept him going. He laughed again, pointing at the soldier's shoes, his uniform, making remarks that revealed not humor, but deep-seated prejudice. Some people nearby felt uncomfortable but chose to stay silent. That silence, heavy and complicit, filled the air. The soldier, though, remained still, not because he was weak, but because he understood something the others didn't. He knew that every second of restraint was a victory in itself. Every insult ignored was a show of control, not defeat. His calmness began to unsettle the mockers. They wanted a reaction, something to validate their smallness. But he gave them nothing. Inside, though, the moment wasn't easy. He had faced enemies in combat zones where the threat was visible, predictable. But here, in a place that claimed to be civil, the attack came in whispers, stares, and smirks. He remembered the long nights overseas, the lives lost, the sacrifices made. Not for one race or one group, but for everyone who called this country home. Yet, here he was, being reduced to a target of ridicule simply for being who he was. A child nearby tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing at the soldier. "Mom, he's a hero, right?" The mother nodded softly, her eyes filled with both admiration and shame. Admiration for the soldier's composure, shame for the world her son was witnessing. The mockers didn't notice. They were too caught up in their shallow performance, desperate to appear superior. But superiority doesn't come from the color of skin or the volume of one's laughter. It comes from character, and that's something they were missing entirely. Every moment that passed was a test of patience, pride, and principle. The soldier's silence became louder than their insults. Each word they threw at him bounced back in the still air, echoing the emptiness of their prejudice. A few more passengers began to take notice, some recording quietly on their phones, unsure of whether to intervene or let the situation unfold. The tension built, not because of aggression, but because of contrast between hate and discipline, ignorance and dignity. Even the airport staff began to notice the scene. One attendant, unsure of how to approach, whispered to another, pointing toward the group. But before anyone could act, the soldier adjusted his cap slightly and took a deep breath. He wasn't angry. He was ready. What none of them knew was that the man they were mocking wasn't just any soldier. He was someone who had seen more, done more, and carried more responsibility than any of them could imagine. His silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy, the kind that comes from experience, authority, and unshakable self-respect. The mockers, emboldened by their own ignorance, mistook calm for weakness. They didn't realize that the same man they were belittling had the power to make one call that could change the entire scene in seconds. But in that moment, he let the world reveal itself, the prejudice, the pride, and the quiet power of patience. The soldier stood there, motionless, his uniform crisp, his composure unshaken. The laughter and snide remarks still echoed faintly behind him, but he didn't let them pierce the calm shield he had built over years of service. He had faced storms far greater than this. The battlefield had taught him to control his heartbeat under fire, to think clearly when chaos surrounded him. And now, in the middle of an airport filled with strangers, that same discipline became his armor once again. His calm reaction was not born from ignorance or fear, but from wisdom, the kind that understands that some battles are not fought with fists or words, but with silence and restraint. He adjusted his posture slightly, his boots clicking softly against the floor as he shifted his weight. Every movement was deliberate, precise, measured. The mocking voices faded into the background, replaced by the dull hum of announcements and distant conversations. He knew that reacting impulsively would only feed their prejudice. They were waiting for him to snap, to confirm the false image they had already built in their minds. But he refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he chose stillness, a quiet defiance that spoke louder than any words could. Those around him began to notice the difference. There was something commanding in his silence, something that made people pause. His face remained composed, but his eyes told a different story. Behind that calm expression lay years of service, sacrifice, and pain that no civilian could easily understand. He had seen his brothers and sisters in arms fall in foreign lands, had written letters to grieving families, had stood under flags folded with trembling hands. He had fought not just for freedom, but for the very respect now being denied to him in this ordinary moment. Yet, instead of anger, he carried dignity, the kind that only true strength can produce. One of the men continued to mock him, trying harder now to provoke a reaction. He made crude jokes, mimicking a salute, exaggerating his voice in a poor attempt at humor. The people nearby started to shift uncomfortably. Some looked away, pretending not to see what was happening. Others stared, caught between curiosity and shame. The soldier remained still, breathing evenly, letting the moment pass through him like wind through trees. Every insult that reached his ears was met not with fury, but with discipline. He had learned long ago that respect cannot be demanded. It is shown, even in the face of disrespect. His calmness began to change the atmosphere around him. The tension that had filled the air started to twist, turning against the mockers themselves. Their laughter sounded forced now, unsure. They were expecting outrage, but all they received was quiet strength. That strength made them uneasy. It reflected back their own weakness, their ignorance, their insecurity. The soldier's presence became a mirror, showing them who they really were. A flight attendant approached cautiously, sensing the unease in the area. She looked at the soldier first, then at the group causing the disturbance. Before she could say anything, the soldier gave her a small nod, a silent assurance that he had everything under control. His tone was steady, his eyes kind, his body language controlled. The attendant hesitated for a moment, then walked away, realizing that she was in the presence of someone who didn't need saving. He wasn't a victim of the situation. He was simply choosing a higher ground. Inside, though, he felt the familiar sting of injustice. He thought of the young recruits he had trained, the speeches he had given about honor and service. He wondered how many of them had faced moments like this, being questioned, mocked, or belittled despite their sacrifices. He wondered how many had lost their tempers and paid for it with their careers or reputations. He had seen it happen before, but he had also seen the power of control, the way calmness disarmed even the cruelest intentions. That power, he knew, came not from rank or title, but from self-respect. A child sitting with his family nearby whispered something to his father, pointing toward the soldier. The father leaned down, listening closely, then looked up with a soft smile. The child's words were simple but heavy, He's not mad, he's brave. The soldier heard it faintly and felt a quiet warmth inside. That small voice reminded him why he carried himself the way he did. Every action he took, every response he gave, was watched by someone who had learned from it. As minutes passed, the noise around him began to fade. The mockers had lost their audience. Their attempts to provoke him had failed, and now they stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. The soldier maintained his stance, still composed, still calm. He didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. His silence was his statement, his calm reaction his victory. Every second he stood there without breaking was proof of the kind of strength the world often misunderstands. The strength to remain in control when provoked, to carry dignity even when others throw insults, and to stand tall not because of authority, but because of principle. The mockery had reached its peak, yet the soldier stood unshaken, his discipline unbroken. The laughter and whispers slowly began to die out, replaced by a heavy silence that carried both confusion and curiosity. People who had once turned their eyes away were now looking directly at him, wondering how he could remain so composed after such public humiliation. But what they didn't know was that behind his calm demeanor lay a power far greater than any insult could provoke, a power that rested quietly in the reach of one phone call. The soldier took a slow breath, his fingers brushing lightly against the phone in his pocket. Years of experience had taught him that not all battles were fought with words. Sometimes the most effective response was not loud or emotional. It was precise, calculated, and delivered at the right moment. He had tolerated enough. The mockers had tested his patience, mistaking restraint for weakness. Now, it was time to remind them that respect is not granted by arrogance, but earned through understanding who someone truly is. He stepped slightly to the side, away from the line of people staring at him. The movement drew subtle attention, but he didn't rush. He reached in his pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled briefly before pressing a number he knew by heart. His voice was calm, steady, and clear. He spoke with the ease of someone accustomed to authority, someone whose words carried weight wherever they went. The surrounding passengers could hear fragments of his tone, not aggressive, not boastful, but commanding in the quietest way possible. The mockers looked at each other, unsure of what was happening. The one who'd been laughing the loudest now shifted uncomfortably. There was something in the soldier's voice that didn't match the image they had created in their minds. It was too confident, too assured. This wasn't a man used to being ignored. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing, someone who had earned the right to be respected, not by demand, but by record. The soldier's call lasted only a few moments, but the energy around him changed instantly. He ended the conversation with a calm, "Thank you, sir," and slipped the phone back into his pocket. No raised voice, no grand gestures, no threats. Just quiet confidence. The people watching didn't yet know what that call meant, but they could feel the shift. Even the mockers sensed something they couldn't quite explain, a growing unease, a realization that they might have picked the wrong person to ridicule. Moments later, the atmosphere in the terminal began to shift. A few uniformed personnel appeared from the nearby security gate, their eyes scanning the area. One of them recognized the soldier instantly and walked over quickly, snapping to attention. "Sir," he said firmly, his voice filled with respect that echoed through the space. The mockers froze. Their laughter evaporated, replaced by a heavy, awkward silence. The soldier gave a simple nod, acknowledging the greeting but not boasting about it. The uniformed officers stepped back slightly, addressing him with the kind of deference reserved for someone of higher rank or distinction. It was clear now that the man they had mocked wasn't just any soldier. He was someone of significance, someone whose name and service commanded respect across ranks. The realization hit the mockers like a wave of cold water. Every word they had said, every smirk, every insult now replayed in their minds, tainted with regret. The bystanders watched in stunned silence as the dynamic completely reversed. The man who had been humiliated moments ago was now being saluted, his calm authority filling the room. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or prove himself through argument. One phone call had been enough. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring dignity, not just his own, but the principle of respect that uniform stood for. People began whispering again, but this time their words carried admiration instead of ridicule. "Who is he?" someone asked quietly. "He must be high-ranking," another replied. The soldier didn't respond to any of it. He wasn't there to impress or humiliate anyone. His goal was never to seek validation. That single phone call was simply a reminder, a message that every action has a consequence, and every word carries weight. The mockers, pale and silent now, avoided his gaze. Their arrogance had melted into embarrassment. They began shifting backward, their earlier confidence gone. The crowd that had ignored the soldier before now looked at him with respect. They saw not just a man in uniform, but a leader, someone who had mastered the art of control. He had taught them, without saying a word, that real strength doesn't come from loudness or dominance, but from the ability to act with precision and purpose. The soldier finally looked toward the mockers, his face expressionless but his eyes sharp. He didn't need to speak. His calm presence was enough to say everything that needed to be said. The people who had mocked him now stood in silence, realizing that the man they had underestimated could change everything with a single call. Not because of power or pride, but because of respect that had been earned through a lifetime of service, honor, and sacrifice. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. The atmosphere in the terminal had shifted entirely, as if the air itself recognized that something important had changed. The mockers who once stood tall with arrogance now appeared smaller, their confidence fading beneath the weight of their own realization. The soldier, still composed and calm, hadn't moved much, but his presence seemed larger now, commanding without a word. The authority that came with his uniform was suddenly visible to everyone. But more than that, the respect he had quietly earned throughout his life radiated from him in a way that no one could ignore. The officers who had arrived stood respectfully beside him, their posture straight, their eyes forward, their tone deferential. The soldier gave short, professional responses, never once raising his voice. His calm tone carried more impact than any display of anger ever could. The same people who had mocked him were now surrounded by the reality of who he truly was. Not just a man in a uniform, but a decorated soldier with influence and honor, someone who had spent years serving his country with integrity. In that moment, authority and privilege were reversed, and those who had looked down on him were now looking up, their own assumptions crumbling before their eyes. A senior airport official soon approached, alerted by the quick movement of security personnel. His expression shifted immediately upon seeing the soldier. He extended his hand respectfully, addressing him with a title that made the onlookers gasp quietly. The mockers' faces turned pale as they realized they hadn't just disrespected a soldier. They had insulted someone of significant rank, someone whose record likely included bravery, leadership, and sacrifice. The weight of that truth sank heavily into the moment. The same mouths that had once laughed were now silent, their earlier confidence replaced with shame. The soldier accepted the greeting with quiet dignity, shaking the official's hand without arrogance. He spoke softly, a few brief words that carried both professionalism and restraint. It was clear that he wasn't there to humiliate anyone, but neither was he going to ignore what had happened. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was simply allowing truth to correct the imbalance that ignorance had created. The mockers avoided his gaze, pretending to be occupied, but every movement they made only deepened the sense of discomfort surrounding them. The crowd began whispering again, though this time the tone was entirely different. Words like respect, hero, and officer floated through the air, replacing the earlier laughter with admiration. The bystanders who had remained silent earlier now watched with quiet awe. They had witnessed the entire shift, from mockery to humility, from disrespect to honor. The soldier hadn't needed to prove himself through confrontation. He had allowed his actions and reputation to speak for him. The power he held wasn't loud or boastful. It was disciplined, controlled, and earned through a lifetime of service. The mockers' earlier smirks had vanished completely. Their expressions were now tense, filled with regret and disbelief. They exchanged nervous glances, realizing too late that they had made a grave mistake. One of them tried to mutter a quick apology under his breath, but the words barely made it past his lips. The soldier didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence had already made its statement. The reversal of authority was complete. The ones who had tried to ridicule him were now standing in the shadow of their own ignorance, exposed for who they truly were. A few passengers stepped forward to express their respect to the soldier. A middle-aged man offered a handshake, saying quietly, "Thank you for your service." Another nodded in silent acknowledgement. The soldier received their gestures with humility, responding with the same composure he had maintained throughout. There was no bitterness in his eyes, no smugness in his demeanor. He carried himself as a man who had faced greater battles and learned that real victory comes not from defeating others, but from mastering oneself. Even the airport staff, who had initially hesitated to intervene, now looked at him differently. They moved with extra care, speaking softly, showing respect, not just because of his position, but because of the way he had handled the entire situation. His behavior had set a tone, one that reminded everyone that dignity doesn't demand attention, it commands it naturally. As the minutes passed, the soldier's calm continued to ripple through the terminal. People felt it, absorbed it, and carried it in their expressions. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Those who had once held social privilege through arrogance now found themselves powerless, stripped of the illusion that made them feel superior. The man they had belittled stood taller than ever, not because he demanded respect, but because he had earned it through his actions, his service, and his restraint. The mockers stood off to the side, their eyes downcast, their earlier bravado replaced with silence. Every glance toward the soldier reminded them of their mistake. The quiet around them wasn't just awkward, it was heavy with realization. The people they had hoped would laugh with them were now looking at them with judgment. The same crowd that once ignored the soldier now defended him in their hearts. Authority and privilege had not just been reversed. They had been exposed for what they truly were: fragile, temporary illusions that crumble in the face of true honor. The moment the truth came out, the terminal was no longer the same. A ripple of realization spread through the crowd, quiet but powerful, transforming the air around them. What had started as a moment of humiliation had now turned into one of revelation. Every person present had just witnessed how quickly arrogance collapses when faced with integrity. The mockers, who had laughed so confidently minutes ago, were now frozen in silence, their faces pale, their eyes darting around nervously, trying to escape the weight of the stares directed at them. The soldier, on the other hand, stood exactly where he had been all along, calm, composed, grounded. He hadn't changed, but the way people saw him had completely transformed. A man nearby, who had earlier ignored the situation, now whispered to his wife, "He's the real deal." His voice carried a mix of admiration and guilt for not speaking up earlier. The whispers grew around them, each one acknowledging the same thing. They had just witnessed dignity outshine disrespect. The soldier hadn't needed to defend himself with words or force. His patience had done that for him. It was as if every insult thrown his way had turned into a lesson for everyone watching. The public reaction was shifting fast. Where there had been mockery, there was now awe. Where there had been prejudice, there was now reflection. People began pulling out their phones, not to record the humiliation anymore, but to capture what had turned into a powerful display of strength and character. Some even lowered their cameras, realizing this wasn't entertainment. It was something deeper, something that deserved respect. A quiet kind of shame settled over those who had laughed earlier or stayed silent when they shouldn't have. It was written all over their faces, the recognition that they had failed to stand up for what was right when it mattered most. The soldier hadn't needed their defense, but his composure made them question their own silence. One of the mockers, now visibly uneasy, took a hesitant step forward. His earlier arrogance had melted into awkwardness. "Sir," he stammered, barely able to meet the soldier's eyes. "I didn't mean," but he couldn't even finish the sentence. The words hung in the air, hollow and meaningless. The soldier didn't interrupt, didn't scold, didn't even respond. He simply looked at the man, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment that said far more than words ever could. That single look was enough to make the man lower his head in shame. It was the kind of silence that forced people to confront themselves. Around them, the crowd continued to shift from passive to reflective. Parents pulled their children closer, whispering small lessons about respect, humility, and judging others too quickly. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, stared at the soldier in awe. His father leaned down and said softly, "That's what real strength looks like." The soldier heard it faintly, his expression still calm, but his eyes softened slightly. He hadn't come here to make a statement, yet the moment had become one, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. The atmosphere grew heavy with realization. People began to understand that what they had witnessed wasn't just about a soldier or an insult. It was a mirror reflecting a truth about society. They saw how easily judgment could replace understanding, how quickly people could choose cruelty over kindness, and how rare it was to see someone rise above it all with grace. The soldier's presence had become symbolic, a living reminder that strength is not measured by retaliation, but by control, that honor is not spoken but lived. Even the airport staff, who had been hesitant earlier, now stood taller, their expressions filled with respect. One attendant approached him quietly, offering assistance, but he shook his head politely, maintaining his composed demeanor. His calmness had an almost magnetic pull. People around him felt it, absorbed it, and carried it in their own posture. The mockers, who once tried to command attention, were now completely invisible in the crowd. No one laughed anymore. No one looked at them with amusement. Instead, they were the subjects of quiet disapproval, a collective awareness that they had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. The soldier's silence became more powerful with every passing second. It spoke to everyone present, about patience, about strength, about what real respect looks like. The public reaction had turned from judgment to admiration, and even those who had done nothing wrong felt changed by what they had seen. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was subtle, steady, and unforgettable. People began to see the soldier not just as a man in uniform, but as a representation of something higher: discipline, honor, humility, and quiet authority. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, the conversation lingered in the air. Strangers talked about what had just happened, each interpreting it through their own lens. Some spoke about prejudice, others about power, and a few about the value of self-control. Everyone had taken something from it. The mockers slipped away quietly, their heads lowered, their laughter long gone. The soldier remained still, eyes forward, his posture as strong as when it all began. He hadn't needed to win an argument to earn respect. He had simply revealed the truth, and the truth had changed everything around him. The terminal had quieted down, yet the echoes of what had just happened lingered in everyone's minds. People moved more thoughtfully now, their steps slower, their expression softer. The tension that once filled the air had dissolved into reflection. What had begun as a display of ignorance had turned into a living lesson, one that no one there would forget. The soldier, still standing tall and calm, had not only changed the atmosphere, he had changed perspectives. What unfolded in front of those passengers wasn't just a confrontation about race or authority. It was a story about respect, about understanding the depth of human dignity, and about recognizing the kind of power that doesn't need to shout to be heard. As people continued to observe him, many began to realize that they hadn't just witnessed an incident. They had witnessed a moment of truth. The world often moves so fast that people forget to notice the quiet acts of integrity that speak louder than outrage ever could. The soldier's composure had reminded them of something deeply human, that strength is often gentle, and true courage is not found in retaliation but in restraint. It was a lesson that unfolded wordlessly but landed heavily on every heart present. The soldier remained where he was, checking his watch briefly before adjusting his uniform. He wasn't seeking validation or admiration. He had carried himself the same way throughout the ordeal, guided not by emotion, but by principle. For him, Dignity wasn't a reaction, it was a way of life. He had worn that uniform through deserts, through conflict zones, through places where respect meant survival. Here, in a civilian space, he had faced a different kind of battlefield, one fought with prejudice and ignorance instead of weapons. Yet, he had handled it the same way he handled every mission, with control, with precision, and with purpose. Across the terminal, conversations continued in hushed tones. A woman sitting with her teenage daughter leaned in close, explaining softly that respect should never depend on appearance. A man who had laughed earlier now sat quietly, his face marked with regret. Even the airport staff moved differently, more aware of the weight of their surroundings. The soldiers' actions had pulled everyone into a moment of collective awareness, a reminder of how easily people forget to treat others with humanity until they are forced to confront their own behavior. One of the officers who had greeted the soldier earlier stood nearby, observing him with quiet pride. He had seen men like this before, men who carried their rank not as a badge of superiority, but as a symbol of responsibility. The soldier had turned an ugly moment into a silent teaching, showing everyone that character doesn't bend under pressure. It rises above it. The lesson was unspoken but undeniable. Respect isn't demanded through fear, it's inspired through example. The mockers were still there, though now they blended into the background. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by uneasy silence. Every time they looked at the soldier, they saw not just the man they had mocked, but the reflection of their own mistakes. They realized that what they had taken for granted, kindness, humility, restraint, were the very things that gave him his strength. They had measured power in the wrong way, assuming it belonged to those who shouted loudest. But the soldier's quiet strength had shattered that illusion. People began approaching him in small gestures of gratitude. A young man stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly as he said, "Sir, I just want to say thank you for everything." The soldier nodded, offering a polite smile, but saying nothing more. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. A few others followed, offering simple words of appreciation, handshakes, or respectful nods. Each interaction was sincere, born from an understanding that they had just been part of something meaningful, a reminder of how respect can redefine an entire moment. In one corner, a little girl pointed toward the soldier, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "He's brave," she said softly. Her mother smiled, replying, "Yes, he is, but not because he fought back. Because he didn't have to." Those words hung in the air, capturing the essence of what everyone had just seen. The soldier's restraint had spoken louder than confrontation ever could. It wasn't just about race or prejudice anymore. It was about human decency, about learning to pause before judging, and about understanding that real power lies in self-control. The soldier finally gathered his belongings, his movements steady, deliberate. As he prepared to leave, people instinctively stepped aside, creating space for him to walk through. No one told them to move. They did it out of respect. The mockers stood silently as he passed, their heads lowered, their earlier arrogance replaced with quiet remorse. Every step he took left behind more than just footprints on the polished floor. It left behind a message. The lesson that lingered was clear and unspoken. Respect cannot be forced, and dignity cannot be taken away. The crowd had seen prejudice confronted not with anger, but with grace. They had watched a man embody the very values he had sworn to protect. In a world quick to judge and slow to listen, the soldier's calm had become a mirror, showing everyone the difference between weakness and wisdom, between pride and principle, between reaction and reason. And in that quiet space, hearts had changed.